I'm Marvin Smith, your host of Funding Bravely, a podcast about courage in philanthropy, what it looks like, why it matters, and how we grow it. For nearly 20 years, I've worked at the intersection of philanthropy, policy, and storytelling, building bridges between donors, communities, and ideas that change systems. Most recently, I helped launch an education, research, and development fund that mobilized more than $200 million in philanthropic commitments to big opportunity areas in pre-K-12 education, and I've led coalitions that have secured major federal investments to expand opportunity for students nationwide. I'm grateful to bring my experience into this podcast, my candor, to provide folks working across the philanthropy and nonprofit sectors rich learnings from some of our nation's boldest leaders. Funding Bravely surfaces the unseen courage of leaders challenging power, moving money faster, and reshaping the practice of our day-to-day work toward justice. The goal isn't just to admire courage, it's to spread it, and to inspire every listener to fund more bravely. Today, I'm really excited to welcome Dr. Elisha Smith Arrillaga to Funding Bravely. As Vice President of Research at Center for Effective Philanthropy, Dr. Smith Arrillaga leads the creation, development, analysis, and release of various research projects and initiatives relevant to the philanthropic sector's most pressing issues. Prior to CEP, Dr. Smith Arrillaga was a faculty fellow and professor of practice in philanthropy and education policy at the University of Texas. And she served as executive director of several national and state-level nonprofits, including the Dana Center, a national center on math and science education equity, and the Education Trust West. Elisha, welcome. It's so great to have you on Funding Bravely.
Thanks so much for having me, Marvin. It's great to be here.
Well, Elisha, today we're talking about what happens when data meets courage, when research challenges the stories philanthropy tells itself and asks, are we really listening and are we willing to act? I want to start personal, though, here. Elisha, you've said before that it's a privilege for you to sit where you do in this work, helping funders and nonprofits see themselves more clearly. What has that seat taught you about the power and the limits of data in driving real change?
Yeah, well, I definitely feel like it's a privilege to be able to do this work. I really believe that data is a powerful tool for making change. And I come to this work, Marvin, myself. Originally, I'm from Mississippi, and both my parents were really involved in the civil rights movement there. And, they had to have a lot of courage to do a lot of the things that they did. My mom filed a lawsuit against the city where she grew up for employment discrimination. And she won that suit, and those anti-discrimination laws are still in place there today. And my dad did a lot of work at the Equal Employment Opportunities Commission in Birmingham, Alabama. And so, that legacy, I stand on the shoulders of not only my parents, but my grandparents who came before them. I mean, my grandmother was the first Black worker in a very small town in Mississippi, in a factory there, and I imagine what she had to endure. And so, it's a privilege to be able to do the work that I do now today. And I have always, ever since I was growing up, been in love with numbers and math and the order that it can give, and really have seen data as a tool for ensuring that resources get allocated in equitable ways. And so I have the privilege of being able to do a lot of that work using data, putting it in the hands of communities. I'm an education policy. When I was working in California in Education Trust West and other places, and now have really been able to take that same set of skills around research and produce independent reports and philanthropy about what works and get that data out to donors and foundations to help them be more effective in their giving in terms of how resources are going into communities too.
Well, thank you, Elisha, for starting personal. It's a privilege to have some of your story from your upbringing, naming some of the shoulders that you get to stand on in this work that are relevant, calling that into mind for our listeners. I want to move from there and just talk about Center for Effective Philanthropy. It isn't an advocacy organization, but you have taken bold steps to make data public and move conversations out from behind closed doors where it often stays in organizations around the country. What gave you the courage to lead in that way? Like, would invite you to get personal here as well, because that's something that a lot of organizations haven't been able to accomplish.
Yeah, I mean, for me, Marvin, I really think about data as a mirror, where it helps to hold up to us things that we may not see or things we may not want to notice about ourselves. So when I was doing a lot of work in math, actually, there's this great math documentary that shows someone running, and then it says, hey, when you just see this person running, you don't know how fast they're going. Maybe if they're training for a marathon or something, they want to run faster, but they need data to like provide information about to help them tweak what they're doing. And now in the role that I'm currently in, I feel like that's a lot of what our sitting in this seat, that's what it is our job to do, right? Is to collect data from nonprofits, from foundations, and then hold that data back up as a mirror to say, if folks think, hey, we're doing a really good job serving the nonprofits that we're working with, or that nonprofits are like, yes, we're doing a great job serving community. Our job is to ask those questions of stakeholders and then bring it back up to folks as a mirror to say, well, hey, are we doing as well as we really think we are? And I feel like I've been really privileged in the roles that I've been in to work with some amazing leaders. And sitting in the seat where I sit now, I get to work with Phil Buchanan, who's the CEO of Center for Effective Philanthropy, who's written a lot, especially in this year, about just the injustice that's happening in around nonprofits. And so it also just provides a space where, it is easier to be courageous. And I think even in moments when it's not easy, it's important to like step out anyway and show what that data says so that people can call themselves to task and really ask themselves, are we doing all that we can do in this moment?
I love that. So data as a mirror. I'm sure there are a lot of folks who don't always like what they see. I'm hearing as well that it helps to have some alignment across your leadership team here to be able to lead with that kind of courage. I want to just ask you to tap in a little bit further into this notion of data as a mirror. I know that there was some pushback for Center for Effective Philanthropy when you all called for more action from funders after 2020 and the murder of George Floyd. You see a lot more foundations being pushed to give more, to move in greater alignment with principles of justice and equity. And some CEOs, ask the question, are you being too hard on the sector? How did you navigate that in such a really monumental time in the country and leadership position, not just for you, but for your organization?
Yeah, I mean, I have to say I was really, during COVID, I joined CEP about a little over 2 years ago. So some of that work I'll say was done a little before I got here, but I would say the principles are ones that we still are employing in this moment, which are we lean really heavily on data to use, to stand on, to have courage, right? So I think in many ways, it makes it easier to be courageous when you have data that says, hey, funders are seeing things this way and nonprofits are seeing it very differently, right? So it's not my opinion, Elisha Smith Arrillaga, right? But it's hundreds of nonprofits who are really calling to task what they see happening. It also makes it the ability to have that courage too is just based on, so many of the stories that we're hearing when we collect qualitative data as well from organizations around the country and what they're enduring, right? Whether they're trying to wrestle with finances and whether or not to close or merge, or whether they're like seeing a huge increase in the number of folks who they've been asked to serve or who are approaching them for help, kind of given the circumstances. And you hear them talk about the courageous things that they're doing, and you just know in your heart that, it is to have courage from where we sit is a privilege, right? To just lift up what they're saying. And so I think also just drawing courage from folks who are in organizations every day doing the work in communities when there's such need also just, gives me at CEP the courage for us to make sure that we're honoring them by sharing what they're sharing with us with funders.
Yeah, thank you for that, Elisha. You've said as well that as a Black woman in data and philanthropy, sometimes that you feel the need to show even more evidence just to be trusted, which I hate to hear that. Nobody should have to feel that way. How do you balance staying data driven while also knowing that data never tells the full human story, even for the person trying to present it to others to move others into action, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think data is just one tool, right? In a tool belt. I mean, it's an important tool, but I actually feel like one of the reasons that I fell in love with data and numbers early in my life is because, you to the point you were making earlier, it felt like in so many circumstances when I would need to lean on, quote unquote, needing to prove myself, having data was a helpful tool. Not the only tool, right? And that also shouldn't be necessary, but it is the world that we live in. We all know data doesn't tell the whole story, right? The way that I like to think about data when I see it used most powerfully actually is I think a lot about, and we try to use actually something a little bit similar in some of a presentation actually we just did last week at the Center for Effective Philanthropy conference, where you present a little data and then you have individuals react to that data. What does that mean for them? Does this resonate with their own experience or not? How are they approaching things that they see in this data that do resonate? What other questions do they think should be asked? And I think there's something powerful about presenting some data, having some conversations about it, then presenting a little bit more data, having a
Mm.
little bit more conversation about it. So the data is not just standing there on its own as if it is the authority. For me, what data is really a conversation starter. Often in the work we did, or some of the work that I've done in the past with different education nonprofits, we would collect data and we share it with parents. And sometimes they say, oh, this is just how I felt, right? Like I knew that my school wasn't doing as well as I thought in reading or in math. And so sometimes it would like affirm some of the thoughts that they were having. And so some people might say, well, why would you collect data if people already knew? What it did in that case was then empower folks to take that data and go to the school board and say, this is not right and we need to change it. And so for me, data is really just one tool, right? If it's the tool you need to affirm the thing that you're thinking, to give you the courage to go and make the request you need to make, then that's powerful. If you have questions about the data, it's a powerful tool for figuring out like how to do a better job collecting it. And so for me, data is really just a starting point. It's not the end.
Yeah. Well, one of the critiques about data in general and how it's used is that it's static. It's often operating behind, the lived experiences, whether if it's of the nonprofits that you all are surveying or philanthropic institutions, and it's not actionable. But it's slow moving. And so one of the things that I know is important to you is turning data around faster, closing surveys. What is it in the maybe less than a couple weeks time to actually release findings quickly? Imagine that. What does that kind of shift reveal about how philanthropy can be more responsive, and why approach the work that way for you?
Yeah, to me, data and research is only as powerful as if people are actually engaging with it, right? So if it's in a beautiful report that's sitting on a shelf or in somebody's inbox, then to me, it's not doing the job of what it should be doing, which is pushing us to ask ourselves questions, think more, think about what other questions we should ask. But we can only do that, right, with data if we're giving it to people in the moment when they need it. So, for instance, this year at CEP, we, for the first time, closed the survey in February and we released a report on that data 10 days later. So it was a really fast turnaround. It was not, necessarily like a joyful.
I'd love to know what those conversations internally look like in that time before you hit public.
Exactly. It was definitely a push. But it was super important because, the new administration had come in January. We surveyed folks in February and we wanted to get that data out to nonprofits and to foundations as quickly as possible as they were thinking about, well, what do we do with our grant making this year? How should we respond? How do we even start to have those conversations? And so making sure that folks had that data in hand as a tool as they started some of those conversations was really important to us. And so is one of the reasons we really pushed to turn that data around quickly. And that's really been our goal with all the data that we've collected this year. We just closed a survey in September of both foundations and nonprofits, national surveys, because we also really pride ourselves around rigor and trying to be representative. And then we also conducted 60 interviews, 30 with nonprofits, 30 with foundations. We turned that data around in a month, which for that amount of data, but given the qualitative nature of the interviews was especially fast. And so that's a lot of what we were able to integrate actually into our conference last week. And then we'll be publishing a full report with that data in early 2026 as well.
Okay, well, if anyone hasn't offered for you all yet, I'd say that kind of capability to release this data that's, gathered inclusively, that's got the rigor behind it, and that's released quickly. That's something I think a lot of organizations could learn from. A capability I think you all could maybe take and repackage and take and run with. I want to just shift, towards some of the data that you all have released recently at your conference to help us understand the nonprofit sector right now and a lot of the challenges that they're operating with under. Specifically, you shared that 81% of nonprofits have experienced or anticipate experiencing increased demand for services. 68% of nonprofits say that the current context has had a negative impact on their ability to carry out work. 61% of nonprofits say that the current context poses moderate to significant risks for them to continue to operate. That's pretty powerful. What is your message to the philanthropic sector in particular with these findings?
Yeah, I think especially that last data point, Marvin, where more than half of nonprofits see the current context as posing a moderate to significant risk for their ability to continue to operate. The number one thing I think is that funders really need to sit with that and think about what is my role given that data, right? Um, and last week at the conference, we talked about a lot of things that funders can do. One of the biggest ones is there's also in the data, which is publicly available now on our website, this huge disconnect between how funders see themselves as understanding the challenges that grantees are facing in this moment. I think like 93% of funders think they understand what grantees are experiencing. And that number for nonprofits is 40% lower. Um, and so I think if we're all trying to solve the same sorts of societal issues, then it's a problem if we have different understandings of what those are and how communities are experiencing them. And so I would say start with really trying to have some open and honest conversations about what nonprofit organizations need right now from funders. And then within that, right, there are lots of things that funders can do. Some funders are increasing their payout. In fact, 30% we found in our survey are doing that, and several more are considering doing so. The other thing that funders can do is, if they can increase their payout, think about funding in different kinds of ways, whether that's starting emergency funds or other kinds of fast turnaround funding. Our data always shows that unrestricted support is helpful for organizations, especially in moments of high stress such as this, and things such as capacity building supports that organizations need, right? So lots of organizations in the data that we have also talk about needing legal support, or others are thinking about new financial streams. And so having the resources to really think through what that looks like for an organization on an individual level is also helpful. But all of that begins with having some open and honest conversations about the challenges that organizations are facing and what communities need right now.
Yeah. What are you learning right now from foundations that are taking this kind of data seriously? Of course, responding, some moving money faster, moving greater amounts of resources than they have in the past. But those foundations that are really wrestling with this data that, speaks to an existential threat for our sector. What distinguishes those who are taking this data really seriously right now and those who may not be?
Yeah, I mean, I would say, and this is just my personal observation from the folks who've really come out publicly and made a stand, like Marguerite Casey Foundation, Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, MacArthur Foundation. They have really strong and courageous leaders, right, who are willing to step out and say the things that other folks may be scared to say. One of the other interesting questions that we asked both funders and nonprofits in this survey was just about risk and willingness to take risk. And you can also imagine that there was some huge divergence there, right? In funders' perception of their willingness to take risk and them seeing themselves as very willing. And there being also around a 40% difference when we ask nonprofits,
Mm.
do you see your funders as really willing to take risk? And, at this moment, being willing to step out and speak truth to power, hold folks accountable to communities who they're supposed to be serving, I think it's really important in this moment more than ever to have courageous leaders who are willing to stand up and do that.
Yeah. Yep. Maybe a public service message to the leaders of foundations across the country that you're not alone in taking courageous steps right now. A lot of your peers are beginning to do so, and we need it. I've personally seen a lot of courageous leadership from the leaders you named at MacArthur Foundation and John Palfrey and Carmen Rojas at Marguerite Casey Foundation. So we hope that they and others serve as models for other foundations to move more boldly in this time.
Definitely so.
Yeah. Um, so I want to shift a bit. Um, Elisha, you've been talking about data as a form of truth and sometimes as your protection. And talking about how that's shaped your leadership. How does that shape maybe how you lead your team today? If you kind of humanize this a little bit down for us from working across with the foundations across the country and day to day inside your org, how does that shape your leadership?
Yeah, I would say one of the main ways it shapes my leadership is that, well, a couple of things. One, I'm always trying to be in community with my team, right? So like understanding not only what's happening at work, but if there are other things they want to share or other ways that um just important to understand like who people are and what else they're bringing with them to work that day. So I really try and, that's not quantitative data, so to speak, and I wouldn't necessarily call it data, but it's just like a baseline understanding of who you're working with, what's going on in the world around you, the context, right? Because I think context is so important. And so really trying to ground myself in the context for the team. And then I also just believe that great ideas can come from anywhere. And so we are a small but mighty team of 6. Um, but I spend a lot of time listening, right? Like asking questions and listening, because there are ideas that have come for projects or ways that we structure the team, or things we can tweak in a report from every person on the team. But that wouldn't happen if I came in with this preconceived notion about who had the right kinds of ideas. And so, in some ways, that's also the way that I approach the research, right? Is not coming in with a preconceived idea, but really being open to what shows up. And so I think that is really paralleled. And then the last piece of it is fun, right? Like, this environment that we're all operating in is tough, right? And there have been a lot of tougher times for, like the things I was mentioning in the beginning, where when my parents were in Mississippi navigating the 50s and the 60s, and my grandparents before them and my great grandparents, right? And so we're privileged to be in this moment, and there's a lot of work we still have to do. But I also owe it to my ancestors to be able to have joy in part of the privilege of being here in this moment is like being able to have joy in the work that we do. And so I try and bring that also into the team, right? So whether that's doing some fun things during our meetings, or joking around or laughing at something that happened around the weekend. And then just bringing it into the work, right? Like being able to laugh at ourselves when we make a mistake. But I think that joy is really central also, and just like how I think about leading too.
I love that. Joy is so important in these times, and thank you for giving mention to that. I want to shift gears a little bit here and talk about data as movement infrastructure. So we've been talking a lot this season, Funding Bravely, about narrative and solidarity infrastructure. Great piece in Nonprofit Quarterly. Recommend folks take a look at. I wonder if we could think about data as infrastructure too in this way, connective tissue that, if funded and shared responsibly, could strengthen trust across the ecosystem. And I wanted to ask you what you think about that, number one, and how funders and nonprofits can co-own learning so that data can become the space of shared accountability as well.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's super important for funders and nonprofits to co-own learning. And, I think some of that kind of goes back to what we were talking about a little earlier when I was saying the discrepancy on that grantee challenges question, right? Of like understanding truly what the issues are we're wrestling with. So I think to co-own that learning, like people have to be in really deep relationship, right? So it's not just okay, we have this grant, see you later, but like truly understanding the work of the organization, the community the organization's working in, and like being in communication about that, which takes time to build that trust and rapport. But I think then the partnership together is even stronger, and it's super important. Um, it's just like one of the ways that I would think about it, especially at this moment, is being, I mean, it's always important, but really important right now.
Yeah. If you could issue one call to funders from your leadership position at CEP right now, what would it be?
Let's see, one call to funders. It would be to listen to, not just listen, but listen and act on what communities are saying. I think a lot of times, not only funders, but just like me, others, all of us as individuals can get caught up in our own narrative, in our own story, in our own reality. And it's important to get out of that. I mean, it makes me think, actually just yesterday, that with this role, I do a lot of speaking engagements at different places, mostly are in the philanthropic community or nonprofit space. But a local organization here reached out and were asking women to come in and talk with groups of 10 and 11-year-old girls in these like 7 to 10 minute power chats, kind of like speed dating for careers. And so I went to a local elementary school and talked with about 15 uh, 8 to 11-year-olds about what it means to be the vice president of research at the Center for Effective Philanthropy, and asked them a lot about their interests and their ideas. It was truly, I always think it's important like that. I always try to make sure I'm constantly doing something like that. Because otherwise I think we can get a little out of touch with actually what's happening, right? Like my son is 11. He's no longer in elementary school. Um, it's important to be out in communities, talking with folks, interacting with others, and just truly trying to understand other kinds of perspectives. And I think it makes you a better person, and it makes you better at what you do every day too.
Well, Elisha, this has been such a lovely conversation. You've talked about using data as a mirror, even if it's not the whole picture, really data as a way to move boldly, courageously, to reflect learnings from nonprofit partners across the sector, bringing people along piece by piece with the data to really invest partners as champions and advocates. The importance of embracing and leading with joy, which I think we all need a reminder of in these times. And I love your call to action to listen. Encourage funders to listen and act on what they're hearing. So thank you so much for joining me for this conversation of Funding Bravely.
Thanks so much for having me, Marvin.
Yeah. Well, to our listeners, if you're eager to learn more about what Elisha and her team are up to, learning and finding and sharing through the Center for Effective Philanthropy's work and data, you can jump into the Mounting Pressure Report if you visit cep.org, and encourage you to be on the lookout for the full report that will be released in early 2026. That's it for Funding Bravely today. Thank you so much, Elisha.
Thank you so much.